Good, hello, give me a chair. Yes, good. Thank you so much for coming to Talks at Google today. I'm very pleased to introduce Simon Bradley. Simon is joint editor of the celebrated Pevsner Architectural Guides, to which he has contributed a number of notable revised volumes. He started Trainspotting aged 11, and his interest in railways has broadened and endured. He's the author of St Pancras Station and lives in London. Please join me in giving Simon a huge round of applause.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming. St Pancras Station, I'm going to start here because that's what you see. What you're seeing is the view from the top of that very tall train shed, the covered area where the trains come in and out, a great Victorian building of the 1860s. The gasometer there, the gas holder, is a bit of a giveaway. And I show you this now lost view because this is where they built the Eurostar extension. Just to perhaps introduce a sense of the railways as a world apart. You know, here's a technology which, when that was first built, was really still quite new. This 1860s, the first mature railways start in the 1830s or just before, and it has to make up its own rules. You know, it's a system, it's a network, and it's invented in Britain. So a great many of the innovations, a great many of the conventions, the language, vocabulary, it's all starting here. And railways are interesting anyway, really, if you're interested in railways. But if you're going to get seriously interested, this really is the best country to do it because for reasons where I'll come on to, but the diversity and the complexity, but also the sense of them as a site of constant innovation. And there's sort of a combination of very old and very new sometimes. It's a quite complicated picture. But this, I was thinking about Google and thinking about information and thinking about complexity and all of those things which I'm sure many of you are working with all the time. This is sort of how to do things before you haven't got software. These are railway tickets, I'm sure you saw straight away. But they're of a very specific type. These were the standard type, which were in use into the 1980s, finally disappeared into the 1990s. They were invented in 1838 by a sort of weird one-off way. There was the young railways drew in all sorts of people from all walks of life. You know, you couldn't kind of learn you couldn't be sort of apprentice to them or anything because they were new. They had to find people, able people, and an unsuccessful cabinet maker from Carlisle called Thomas Edmondson got a job at one of the stations on the Newcastle and Carlisle Railway, one of the very early lines. It was built completely isolated from anything else at that time. And sort of in his spare moments, he began to think about how they could improve the ticketing. Up to that point, tickets were written out by hand, largely. You went in, and the booking office was called booking office because you booked your journey, and a clerk he'd have some sort of printed form, but he would write them out. And this was very laborious and also rather open to abuse. He could write one thing in the book, and he could issue the ticket, he could take money, and he could fiddle it. You know, there was no easy way of keeping a record. So that, as well as being time-consuming and slow, it was also, leaky. So Edmondson thought, well, if you print the tickets in advance, but also you number them in advance, then you don't need to keep a record. You don't need to keep a counterfoil. The tickets themselves are your record. So they were put into, and he more or less made this all himself at home, a series of cylinders, metal cylinders, with a spring at the bottom, push the tickets up, you take the top ticket out, it's got a number on, you keep taking the tickets, and the number remaining gives you, by subtraction if you like, the number that you've sold, and someone can come along and check that the amount of money you've got, because everyone's paying by cash, is equal to the number of tickets sold. So this is a very clever system, and he tries to persuade his superiors to adopt it, and they're a bit sort of not very interested, but then he just starts sort of hawking it around other railway companies, and within a couple of years he's got his own business, he's licensing his system to other railways, and it conquers all the other lines. And they're not very big. If you're a bit older, you probably remember these things. They're about 1 inch by 2, quite easy to lose. And the convention until fairly recently, I mean, in the coming into Victoria, into the early 70s, I think, was that the ticket collector would tear, if you had a return ticket, he'd tear it in half and give you back the other half. So people talked about the return half. So the half ticket, 1 inch square, was even easier to lose. And you can imagine sort of, music hall jokes and things about I've lost my return half, you were stranded, or you had to buy another ticket, which would be expensive. So there's the Edmondson system. What Edmondson didn't anticipate, and what nobody anticipated, was what was going to happen when all these railways joined up and from a series of separate lines became a system or a network. And that meant you could travel through, but you were travelling through from the territory of one company to another. You might be travelling through several company territories. You might be travelling or sending goods through several company territories as well. I won't talk much about goods and freight, but it's at least as important as the passengers in terms of the business side of things. So what happens then is that in the Midlands, where lines first really start coalescing, a few companies get together and they set up what's called a railway clearinghouse. It's a place where all the costs and income can be assessed and sorted out, usually on the basis of mileage. So this requires a very complicated series of calculations. You have to work out exactly how long all the lines are and agree with one another about how long the lines are, apportion a charge for carrying a person, a half fare, parcels, freight, all the rest of it, and pass your records on. So the photograph you see, this is the Railway Clearinghouse in about 1930, I suppose. It's not a very well recorded building at all. There are very few photographs of what actually went on there. But what the women there are doing, it does seem to be almost entirely women. They've got on the table in front of them huge bundles of these Edmondson tickets, because the tickets themselves then became, if you like, the information, what was passed on. The tickets became their own sort of receipts, their own counterfoils. And so they're checking, they're number crunching. I think before anything, even like an adding machine, certainly can't see one. So really, of course, I mean, the electronic media can do more and more things all the time, but there's something awe-inspiring about the complexity and just the size and scale of what the railways were doing through entirely old-fashioned, pen and paper sort of media. Again, within living memory. It still exists, the Railway Clearinghouse, the buildings there. It's like an enormous and very, very plain Georgian terrace somewhere north of Euston Station. You could be mistaken for thinking it had been a box factory or something like that. But it grew and grew because eventually all the British companies, except for a few very small ones, all came on side. So now back to the origins. This is the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830. The first mature passenger railway. There were other ways of travelling by train, behind a horse-drawn vehicles on rails, things like that. But this is the first one that had publicly advertised, timetabled, steam-hauled trains, and was conceived as such from the beginning. And this introduces the question of class. Then there was first, second, and third class, and it doesn't take much thinking to see which ones they are. The upper train is all first class. They had separate first-class trains originally, and the carriages look like what they actually were, which is stagecoach bodies. You think of each carriage there is made up of effectively three stagecoach or private road carriage bodies. That's how they were built. They were built by the same people who were building the stagecoaches, because there wasn't suddenly a new industry of railway carriage building. You just found someone who could build these things for you. And then right at the very back, you see what's called a carriage truck. It's a flat wagon onto which you could drive your carriage if you happened to be wealthy enough to have your own carriage. So people, having done that, they would actually travel in them. And it sounds a bit outlandish, and it was possibly not entirely safe, because you get cinders from the locomotive falling on you and things like that. But and it was certainly exposed. But the idea sort of came back when the Eurostar train started running. Because if you've ever done it, you drive your vehicle into a covered wagon in this case, and you go through the tunnel and you come out on the other side. So it's an idea that came, went, and then has come back again in a very specific way. Below that, second class and a version of third class, I think we've got more or less exposed. As it settled down, eventually third class, and we'll see some early examples later, were actually completely open. They were almost like sort of cattle trucks without roofs, at least in the early years of the railway. So you're creating a series of social spaces because, well, stagecoaches were social spaces too, but more people are travelling and they're travelling further, and the experience, the chance to travel is moving down the social scale because it's cheaper. So this is First Class. This is First Class in 1855, a painting called First Class, The Meeting. And I show it because it gives the idea of close confinement with strangers. And at its loveliest, because what's happening here is the young man, you can see he's an army officer, he's got his sword, is meeting the thoroughly respectable gentleman, a papa or guardian or an uncle or something, and the young lady who's with him, and they're falling in love. And it was all sort of spelt out, you know. But he's sitting safely between them, you know, he's earnest and obviously a good sort, and she's obviously a good sort too because she's rather modest and shy. All these details matter. There was a previous version of this painting shown at the Royal Academy the year before with the same title, and the old gentleman is sitting in the corner seat and he's fallen asleep, and the young lady is looking a bit less shy, and the young gentleman, he's not an army officer, he's a fisherman, you know, he's out, you know, he's on the pull, you might say. And people thought this painting was rather immoral. So this gives you a sense of this sort of slightly sort of stuffy and preposterous ways in which the Victorians could moralize their art. You know, art had to be improving or it had to be decorous. But it's also a precious view of something which wasn't very well recorded at the time, the interior of a railway compartment, first-class railway compartment, as they reached their early maturity. So you see lots of plush, lots of upholstery. It's a luxurious sort of space, difficult to keep clean, but you know they had lots of labour to try and do it. There are things, slightly mysterious things known as cromets hanging on the upright sort of like mullion thing by the window. These were to help you in and out. You grabbed onto them, or you could rest your arm in them if your arm got tired, apparently, though it sounds more like a way of kind of cutting off your circulation. And these lingered until sort of early 20th century. The thing above the old gentleman's head, that's his hat. They had straps or strings drawn across the roofs of the carriages for gentlemen's hats, because hats were all, you know, they were the stovepipe kind then. And you turned them upside down and you fitted them in, and you didn't tread on them or, you know, knock them over, because they were both fragile and expensive. Now, down to second class. This is about 1890, so rather less idyllic and probably rather more realistic view. Well, yes, the recent coinage man-spreading. There's definitely some man-spreading going on here. And also they're smoking. You couldn't smoke in early railway carriages, but as more and more people in the wider world started smoking, cigarettes came in, for instance, in the 1850s, and it got very hard to police. One reason being that you couldn't walk up and down the train checking who was smoking, because the trains were still made up of these separate compartments. So once you were in your compartment, that was your space until you got the chance to get out, and that might be for hours and hours and hours, you know. So you had to think about, you know, how you dealt with lavatories, how you dealt with refreshments and food. There's a lot about this on the book, and I won't go on about it. But gradually, we get the modern joined-up train with the carriage, with the corridor or the connections between the carriages. And on a long-distance journey, you might also have a buffet car, a restaurant car, something like that. So, close confinement with strangers. Well, there's something edgy about it, potentially, and worse than that, there'd be something dangerous, and very occasionally something fatal. This is from a rather disreputable publication called the Illustrated Police News, which was just true crime stuff. So very cheaply produced commercial artists summing up scenes from the most lurid, you know, and exciting crime stories. And this was its front page story. This was the Balcombe Tunnel murder. If anyone come in from Brighton or come through the Balcombe Tunnel, if you come that way, then you are passing through the site of Britain's second railway murder, by which I mean an attack on a stranger in a train. There was an unsuccessful would-be actor. You see him, his rather unimpressive profile at the bottom, and anxious for more money to keep up his sort of flash appearance. He attacked a banker, stockbroker in the compartment, and robbed him of his gold watch and money, threw him out, was caught and then escaped. The police didn't really distinguish themselves. He was being watched in a house but they didn't watch the back, so he just escaped out of the back. Then they found him. He sort of went to ground somewhere in London, and they found him in his lodgings with sort of false whiskers and things from his theatrical friends, trying to disguise himself. But it was no good, and he was eventually hanged. So moving on from that model of the compartment, this is an early sort of central gangway type carriage. This is from the Great Western Railway in the 1930s. This type was known well before then, but the British system for long distance journeys remained, the preferred form remained the kind with a corridor down one side and a series of compartments with sliding doors opening off it. Now these were around on our system until about 10 years ago, and going back more like 15 years, you start to find them, especially on Southern Electric, where the first class remain of that type. They became more common, so you probably will have encountered some of these. Latterly, it tended to be first class that had the compartments, and second class that was all open, but now even first class is open. And whenever they did a test, whenever they sort of did a public survey, everyone preferred the compartment type. There was something about the early travelling in compartments and getting used to the idea that for all its disadvantages in terms of being stuck in one space and difficulty of moving through the train, then people preferred it. But finally the railways persuaded us that we should move into the more space efficient kind, or rather stop giving us the choice. And now pretty well everyone travels in something rather more like, if you like, the body of an airliner. And as we're on so close to Victoria and Southern Electric territory, I couldn't resist showing this. The Doubledeck train. This is it on the 1st of November 1949 on a trial trip, and everyone looks a bit apprehensive. But it entered service the following day. There were only ever 8 of these carriages, 2 sort of 4-car units. And they worked out of Charing Cross and Cannon Street on the Dartford Loop. And they were an attempt to fit more people in. I mean, it's a standard dilemma of overcrowded trains in the rush hour. The idea being that you could see, you put people on top, you get more space. So there are little staircases in there. They weren't a success. One reason they were just too cramped. The thing called the loading gauge, which is a railway term for how big you can make your vehicles, carriages, locomotives before they start hitting things, how the clearances around the tunnels and the platforms and the buildings and all of that, and also the other tracks, didn't really allow British trains ever to push to that double-deck stage. But they're relatively common on the continent and in other countries. You do find these double-deck, especially commuter carriages, but it didn't quite work here. So now leaving the trains and moving into the network, the infrastructure, the buildings, all of those things. I'll show a few views of railway stations. This is the very first Euston station, 1837. So only just Victorian, if you like. That's the year Queen Victoria comes to the throne. So railways are a pre-Victorian invention in this country at least. And there you can see lined up, those are some open third-class carriages. So imagine, 1837, all you could do was go to Birmingham, but that's still a long way and took you several hours because the train would go at a maximum maybe 30, 40 miles an hour if you were lucky. But open carriages are running, to Scotland basically by the time that they're finally put a stop to because the government starts steering the quality of what we now might call the passenger experience. They insist on certain minimum standards. So this is the carriages. The space it's under, well, it's the absolute novelty of all of this. You have to think that nothing like this building had existed 10 years before. It's using all the new technologies. It's using mass production of cast iron. That gives you those columns and the arches between, and the rather spidery network of braces and hangers which are sitting underneath the roof, and the framing of the roof too. The roof itself is wooden with sort of a few glass windows in. This is quite a common early type of railway train shed, as we call them, the shelter for the trains. Not so common now because most of them have gone. But actually, if you go to Dublin, where there's been much less pressure to rebuild and much less expansion, several of the railway termini there are 1840s buildings, and they still have train sheds of just this type, even down to that rather elegant, you see those arches in the arches of the sort of space between the arch and the horizontal above it, those diminishing circles. So you see that pattern. It was a way of giving lightness and strength to something, but also an aesthetically pleasing, the way like almost not quite like a fractal, but the sort of diminishing, same shape but diminishing in size in sequence. Now we jump forward because again this is all changing very quickly, and it's getting bigger very quickly, and they're realizing they've sort of, not quite that they've created a monster that they can't control, but that they, the growing lad is going to require rather more by way of, bigger clothes and all the rest of it for his future prosperity. So this is Paddington in the 1850s. Sorry, yes, it's 1860s image of Paddington, and Paddington is built in the 1850s. It's a famous painting, or famous in its day, called The Railway Station, and it shows you sort of every type and condition of person all about to travel on the train. It's full of incident. There's some plainclothes policemen arresting a pickpocket in one corner. You can see who's going off to the races, you can see who's respectable and not quite so respectable, the different classes and types. And because again, this is the railways as a sort of social condenser, or a place where people come into close proximity on much more equal terms than they might have expected. The Duke and the peasant are rubbing shoulders briefly, and they're both customers of the Great Western Railway, even if they're going to be travelling on different carriages. You'll see also that the luggage was put on top early on, and then they'd pull a tarpaulin over it in case it rained. This arrangement didn't last. They started having separate guards vans, usually, which would take your baggage for you and then would put it out at the correct station, so it had to be correctly labelled. More like the airline model. You didn't, with your big luggage, you didn't travel with it. You couldn't try and take it into the carriage, there just wasn't the room. But look at that roof up above. Now we've got something arched, and the arch form gives you more potential to sort of push the dimensions. So Paddington has got 3 parallel arch spans, and they're wider than the Euston ones, which was just a simple up and down ridged roof. I could go on and on about all this, because the first railway book I wrote was that little monograph on St Pancras Station. And St Pancras is where the climax comes, because that was 245, 246 feet across, over 100 feet high. I forget the exact metric equivalents, but that was the widest single span structure in the world. And it kept that record for 20 years. So again, it's the railways sort of forcing innovation and pushing technology to its limit. So it's an exciting story, that they're always, up until about 1880, 1900, that quite a few major themes in the railway are just about bigger, faster, better. And faster, actually, obviously, sort of goes on into our own times. So, Paddington Station, well, one more image. Another instance of the things that railways are driving forward without even really planning or expecting to do so. Hotels. They don't start building hotels, but then they think, well, we've got a captive market. People are going to want to travel early. People are going to arrive late at night. How nice to have a hotel ready and waiting for them. Or looking at it another way, why should all this custom go to people who aren't part of our company? So stations start being planned with hotels, and Paddington is one of the earliest. That hotel is still there. The image is one of the little pictures, carriage pictures, that used to be put up in those railway compartments. So it's the railway sort of advertising itself, if you like, to its passengers. They weren't all adverts. Sometimes they were just pretty views, but then again, the pretty views were of places you could go to on the railway. So, and these carriage pictures would sit there for decades. I mean, there were still Edwardian, Victorian ones knocking around in the system in the 50s. And I think that's something that's been lost from the system now, the sense of the very old stuff still working alongside the very new. You have to look at the buildings now to get that sense of the depth of historical time. And the genius behind the Great Western was Brunel. And Brunel's a sort of rather culty figure now, and I think he fits a certain sort of modern idea of what a genius and innovator should be, because he's a bit of a maverick, he's a bit of an outsider. He cuts a dash, you can probably visualize him with his hat and his cigar. And he sort of forces his ideas through. People think the ideas they won't work, and they will. Well, a great deal of this is true, and he was a genius, and he was a magnetic figure, and we're sort of lucky to have him, or have had him. But it didn't all work quite as planned. So this image is, it's called the Gloucester the change of gauge. And the point being that the original railways, the first railways built in this country and then taken around the world, were to the same size, 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails. So that's the gauge, as the term goes. So you can take a train from Britain and you can run it all the way across the continent. You can run it all the way from the top of the Americas down to the bottom. There are parts of the world where the gauges are different. India is one, Russia is another. But as a rule, there is what's called standard gauge. You know, it's there in Australia, it's there in New Zealand, it's the same here. And that's not just because of Britain being the model, it's partly that, but it's for obvious reasons of being able to run through. Well, Brunel, before this had become quite so clear as it rapidly did become, looked at the system and thought, well, no, he's going to redo it from scratch because that's how he liked to work. So he thought this gauge is too small. You make it wider, make it half as wide again, 7 foot and 1/4 inch in this instance. Then you could have more stable trains. You can have trains that will therefore run faster. Advantages all round, bigger carrying capacity. You'll need fewer carriages and wagons to carry the same stuff. And it all worked perfectly except for the question of what happens when you have to carry stuff across country. Going from London to Bristol and back, the original Great Western, it was a better railway. It was smoother, faster, all of those things. But if you wanted to take your produce from the West Country up to the north or vice versa, then everything had to be taken off the wagons and put onto other wagons. And this was extremely expensive and inconvenient. Passengers not quite so bad because people were used to changing trains, used to having their luggage taken off one train, put on another. But goods don't walk across platforms, you've got to do it yourself. So there was a great deal of this. And what happened as a sort of compromise was that we had what was called mixed gauge. You would have tracks with both widths, so you could run both kinds of train. And then gradually after that, the broad gauge withered away. And it was a long time dying. The last broad gauge trains ran in the 1890s. And they were extraordinary things, you know, sort of with a great big broad squat-looking locomotives, very stable. Stability was an early preoccupation before they'd worked out that the better you made the track, the faster you could run trains and still keep them stable. So in a sense, Brunel was trying to solve a problem that rapidly didn't exist. And it gets stranger. This is the only appearance of the word cyberpunk in my book, because the atmospheric railway is so unearthly and weird and ghostly. Brunel didn't invent it. I'll explain the principle first. Rather than having a locomotive burning coal, generating steam, pulling the train, the idea was that you would take that power generating function and just put it to one side. You build a pumping station. There the steam is generated, the engine goes up and down, and you pump air out of a big cast iron pipe that runs down the middle of the rails, as you see. This is all pre-photography, so this is a very good reconstruction drawing from about 20 years ago, I think. And then the train has a sort of thing like a piston inside, and on top of the cast iron pipe there's a flap which is sealable, and as the air is pulled out, pumped out I should say, of the pipe, the train is drawn along. And then you can brake the train by releasing the vacuum in the pipe and so on. So, and this actually, and it did work, but it worked only in very limited ways. So the first successful use of it is a little line in Dublin, and it just goes up and down. It goes up every half hour or something. You keep pumping, the vacuum is recreated, and then you can run it back down by gravity because it's all on a slope. So that's a good model. And they try and make it work in the London to Croydon line. Again, we're in the sort of Victoria territory. And they sort of almost make it work. But all the things that don't work, what happens when two lines meet? What your pipes do? They had to build a flyover. It's the first railway flyover to cross from one line to the other because these lines are effectively self-contained. How do you reverse? What happens if one pumping station breaks down? So they could just about make it work. And Brunel implemented it on a huge scale on the line down South Devon. You may remember where the sea broke through at Dawlish winter or so ago and severed the line for a while. Well, that's the place. Other things went wrong. The sea air was much more damaging to the technology of the pipe than it had been further inland. There's a legend, which I think must have some basis in truth, that the sealant of the slot along the top of the pipe, which was made of leather, greased leather, that rats came and ate it. That wasn't the main fault. The main fault was it got too brittle and hard. But you're going to get rats, aren't you? And they're going to have a good old nibble if they get the chance. This thing cost a fortune. Brunel invested a lot of money in it himself because that division between the engineer and the sort of capital raising function was blurred back then. You would invest in your own projects, you had a stake in them. And that was meant to create confidence too. But eventually they gave up. So it worked, it worked for a few weeks or a few months, or it half worked. But it was a terrible idea. And Brunel had his good friend, but often friendly rival, Robert Stevenson, son of George Stevenson, telling him so. It wasn't for the want of telling. So this is Brunel, if you like, at his most dedicated and dogged and innovative, but also just completely wrong. But it's a wonderful story. So now moving away and moving closer to our own times, I'll just say something about modernization, or what actually we've now called branding. In the 50s, mid-50s, British Rail said, right, we're going to modernize, we're going to have electric and diesel trains. And a lot of the ways in which that was planned were misconceived because they couldn't anticipate the effect, especially of road transports, both for passengers and for freight. So then there was a convulsion in the early 60s, mid-60s, with the beaching cuts, as well remembered. A lot of lines, rural lines, less used lines were closed down. But the positive side of that was an attempt to modernize the railways route and branch. And that meant thinking about how it looked. That meant, for the first time really, thinking about the railways as a national brand. So that was when British Railways became British Rail. That was when the long familiar but now vanished colours of blue and white, or just all blue for the carriages, came in with the yellow ends. So you see an early version of that there in this model. And that was where the double arrow sign came in. It was invented by, what was one of about sort of 60 or 80 designs supplied by the Design Research Unit, which was a very innovative sort of all-purpose design house. It was designed by a sort of 21-year-old who's still around, a man called Jerry Barney, and he just happened to come up with the best idea. I mean, it's pure like advertising agency, the young cub gets the best idea sort of story. And you should see some of the others. They're so fussy and kind of confusing. But the idea of the two trains passing, or the speed or something, anyway, whatever it was, that took. And there you see it. And there's Tamworth Station in Staffordshire, which was being rebuilt as part of an electrification scheme going up to the north. So this is the whole new railway. Everything's new except for the very line itself. The route itself is a very early Victorian line, but everything else is new. Trains, track, electrification, architecture, signage, the lot. And there is a design guide which, with kind of amazing sort of control freakery, showed you exactly how the lettering should be done, the intervals between the lettering, how to proportion everything, align everything up. I mean, it's a sort of rather uptight modernist designer's paradise, this sense that you can sort of, everything's on the grid, everything's designed. But it was a very, very good design. And I learned quite late in writing the book, but in time to put it in, the Danish state railways liked the look, the corporate image of British Rail so much that they just bought it, basically. Now, I haven't been to Denmark. I don't know how far the stations still have all the same signage, but the photographs of Danish railways in the 70s, everything looks like British Rail signage used to, but with those Danish diacritical marks and sort of funny signs on the letters and things. But it must be the only instance, I think, of Scandinavian public design copying British public design, because Norway's always going the other way, So there, pride in British Rail. Now, if you'd been at this station in, I think, 1948, you might have seen my father trying to find a pair of binoculars that he'd just been given by a well-off auntie. Binoculars, an even more expensive thing then than now, because he'd gone there train spotting. He had come from Birmingham, but Tamworth was where you saw faster, better trains, expresses, and some bastard had stolen his binoculars, and he never got them back, and he never dared tell his auntie. But I've talked finally about the train spotting side, or the enthusiasm side. I mean, I'm used to just people kind of collapsing the enthusiast, the historian even, into the train spotter. But I don't really mind, because I was a train spotter too. And in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, it wasn't a marginal thing. This is what actually sometimes gets forgotten. It was an absolutely ordinary, common boyhood thing, really, boyhood and adolescence. It was like an interest in anything else you might be interested in at that age. And it was free or cheap anyway. You bought a little book, you ticked off the numbers. You did it with your friends. It was a social activity. So that's the first proper train spotter's handbook, 1943. So all that sort of the signs of the kind of generosity of certain sorts of wartime censorship. A private publisher could publish the details of all Britain's locomotives and their numbers in the midst of the war. Well, I don't suppose on the other side they thought that this information was for general circulation. It might have hadn't been militarily sensitive. And that's Newcastle Central Station. And in fact, by the age of 15, the family moved back north, and so the lads on the right are in the uniform of my school, the Royal Grammar School. So that gives you the idea of it being a social thing, I think. This isn't some kind of sad loner with his anorak and thermos flask. There are lots of these boys. They're having fun. They're together. They'll no doubt be sort of pushing and shoving and things. We know this because the reason they were on the castle, that's the great castle of Newcastle itself, was that they'd all been banned from the station for for misbehaviour. So the station was closed to train spotters. Exactly the same thing happened at Tamworth. Tamworth was the first station to be closed to train spotters because they were rushing up and down the platforms and generally getting in the way. That was probably when it became a national phenomenon, and I sort of tracked the story through the national newspapers. The word train spotter first appears in around sort of 1947, 48, with other variants of the same name. People don't, it's a youth cult, it comes up from below. No one's really encouraging it apart from a few publishers who are profiting from it. The railways are in mixed, two minds about it because they can be a damn nuisance. But gradually they come to an accommodation. And finally, last but one, what came out of that, and what came out of that great convulsive modernisation, I think more drastic than that in any other country. Steam disappears far quicker than people expect. Masses of lines are closed, which people thought and expected were going to stay open. There's this big redesign. Suddenly everything looks different. Everything is all modernist, and it had been a bit more traditional. And so this creates a gigantic nostalgia among the generation who are spotters especially, and a desire to save things. And what starts as a little local ventures here and there gradually becomes a sort of national movement. And now you can travel back in time. This is the Mid-Hants Railway down in Hampshire, which aims at just that period really, 50s and 60s. So there you see locomotives of that time and carriages in the livery of that time. An engine shed built from scratch. It's on a closed down line. It's on one of the lines that was fell victim to Dr. Beeching. And as you probably know, there are dozens and dozens of these lines. Some of them excellent, some of them not quite so good. If you're curious and you've never been to one, I recommend you start with the Bluebell Railway down in Sussex. Easy access from Victoria and a connection to the main line. That was the first one to take over a disused part of the main network. And that's been running now for 55 years. So this is part of the British way of life, you might say. But there's always something kind of distant as well and about the past that you can't capture. So I'm going to end with an image which I think conveys that quite well. These are men of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway in about 1910, demonstrating with sort of wonderful unself-consciousness some of the hand signals used when shunting.
Thank you very much. I haven't realised Trainspotting was almost sort of an extension of collecting Pokemon cards. It's ticking off the boys and wanting to collect the whole set.
Yeah, it's the collecting instinct, but there was also the excitement of the unpredictability of it. And also it was a bit edgy, and that always sounds ridiculous, but standing on a platform, that's easy, anyone can do that. But what you want to do is get to where the best trains are, and that ultimately probably is going to mean trespassing, or at least you try and talk your way into places. So places where there were engine sheds, locomotive sheds, that was where you wanted to be, because then you could just hoover the things up, And if you couldn't get in by an arranged visit, you might just kind of go around anyway. And you did get caught, and you did get thrown out sometimes, and threat to have your name taken. And
Brilliant. 10 minutes for any questions? Any questions? Yes. If you could repeat the question back.
So what lessons from history could improve the state of the railways today? And the example I'd give is that if we had had either wider gauge from the beginning, so if we'd gone for being able to run faster trains, or if we were able to, you mentioned clearances before, like if you could just lower all the lines 2 feet and run bigger trains, for example, are there any of these things that you think aren't part of current policy but could be implemented today?
Well, lessons from history, this gets a bit political, I suppose, because the railways were nationalised, and then they were privatised. And the nationalised system, well, this is complicated territory, but you can certainly say that you point to the figure that British Rail had as a subsidy in its latter day existence, which is about £1 billion a year. And it was run on a shoestring, but it was lean and efficient, and it knew what it did well, and it knew what it would do if it had a bit more money, more electrification especially, reopening some old lines, things like that. The privatised system now has a subsidy of about 4.55 billion, but has twice as many passengers. Now, twice as many passengers doesn't always mean that your line's going to get cheaper to run, but to be honest, if your turnover doubles and your fares go massively up, you should be able to do that. So we now have a system which is more expensive, has a much higher turnover, and also requires more subsidy. And the reason, frankly, is the way it was privatised. As Christian Walmart, the writer on railways and transport, said that it took a single system that ran at a modest subsidy and broke it up into about 100 companies, every single one of which was required to show a profit. So how do you do that? And the answer is there are subsidies fed in all sorts of ways, including that Network Rail, which the publicly owned body that owns the track and the stations, just racks up huge debts. So that's got to 34 billion. And then when the EU said that this is a con, you're using this to keep it off the balance sheet because this is part of the national debt, that's now been added to the national debt. So that's the privatised system behind the sort of headline figures. And it just amazes me that these frankly rather scandalous arrangements aren't that well known. So I mean, I would think bring as much of it as you can back into public ownership or public-private partnership. And it's happening in a modest sort of way with the overground system, because those take lines which were previously franchised out to various operators, like the North London line, North London Link, and they then become part of the Transport for London. And the service always improves and always becomes more efficient, but it's no longer having to pay out. So there we are, politics.
I would follow that up just to ask that if, let's say, a privatisation or a bringing it all back into one group happened, if you were running that group, what would be the first things you might change, maybe more again from the technical perspective in terms of being able to do more with what you now have brought together?
Yeah, I think electrification is the one that does work, and is very pleased that just yesterday, was it, that the pause, as it was called, on some of the electrification projects on the main lines, that's been unpaused. I don't think people in the industry expected that to happen. I think it might drift for years, but a lot of that work had started. So before too long, you'll be able to go to major cities, Cardiff, Bristol, that was already happening, but Sheffield, Nottingham, and really just do more of that, actually. Not every line, because it doesn't pay for smaller lines, but you could electrify up to Aberdeen, that would be good. You could electrify down to Plymouth, that would be good. There's quite a lot still to do, and Britain's massively behind the continent in how far the lines are electrified.
Round to the back.
So it sort of follows on quite well from that. What do you think of HS2? Good idea, bad idea, more important, less important than electrification?
Yeah. HS2, what do I think? Well, slightly mixed feelings, partly because there are existing lines which could deliver, by electrification and other relatively modest improvements, could deliver a lot. But it is disruptive to electrify and improve an existing line. You have to take possession of the track, you have to put people on buses over bank holidays, all of that. The best argument for it, I think, is to increase capacity, because if numbers are carrying on going up and up, then the existing lines, eventually they reach their limit, however good the signalling, however fast and long and crammed the trains, So to have an extra route, that would be a very good thing. And I think that's a better argument than the accelerating thing, because as a lot of business people said when they first suggested, we're going to shave, 15 minutes off the journey to Birmingham. Well, it's sort of, your now train time is work time. Now, one of the themes in the railway history is what you do with all that time. There's a great explosion in reading and publications and things aimed specifically at travellers. And you can work. And then, of course, more as technology advances, you can do sort of almost anything really. You can have your business meeting on the train through Wi-Fi. Railways are difficult technology to make all those remote wireless technologies work. I couldn't give you chapter and verse, but there's something about the huge amounts of metal moving at high speeds against other huge amounts of metal. You know, it's not just going through the tunnels, it's something electromagnetic. I don't know what's going on. So they'll always be difficult, I think, and probably airliners will be easier. But that's, yeah, in the basic figures for travel, I think the time savings, at least for the first phase, are not so amazing as we're sometimes told.
Which is your favourite station in the UK?
Ooh.
And why?
That's tough. I might go all sort of wistful and say there's Ravenglass, which is on the Cumbrian coast, where we tend to have holidays. But there's a change to a narrow gauge railway, almost a miniature railway as it's called because it's so small. It's a sort of 1/3 model of the national system. It's worked mostly by steam locomotives. It goes right up into the hills and the fells. And it's a proper piece of public transport because there are no buses or anything. So you get off the train at Ravenglass and then there's this tiny train waiting for you and it takes you 5 miles up into the hills. So yeah, I'd say Ravenglass.
How inefficient were steam trains compared to, the boring modern ones? I mean, in Epping, for instance, you pay about £10 for a 5-mile trip on the Epping Ongar Railway,
Yeah.
and then you get to Epping and you pay £7 for a travel card that will take you throughout the
Right.
entire London. How much of that is steam's really, really expensive, and how much is that just because it's an amateur run railway with huge costs?
How inefficient was steam? It was massively, cripplingly, staggeringly inefficient is the answer. When it's the only way of doing anything, yes, it's more efficient than a horse and cart. But a great deal of the coal burnt by the locomotive just flies out of the chimney. You know, it doesn't burn it as efficient as a power station does. So that's one reason why electrification is more efficient than steam and why they tried to electrify as soon as they could when they could afford it. Other than that, they spent a huge amount of time just kind of coming to the boil or having to be emptied and cleaned out afterwards because you can't just keep them burning the whole time. You have to, make up the fire and then take the fire out. The water clogs the boiler up with scale. They've got huge numbers of moving parts which require constant attention. Where do you start really? And they were cheap to build. That's the other thing. They were much cheaper to build than diesels or electrics. So one of the wrong turnings in railway history after the Second World War was to say, well, look, here we are. We've got all this coal. Oil is something we have to import because there's no North Sea oil then. And electrification will do it when we can afford it. But in the meantime, we'll build lots more steam locomotives. So the last steam locomotive, this is extraordinary. The last steam locomotive for the national system for British Railways was built in 1960. And even then, they thought it might have a working life of 20 years. And in 1955, they were talking about steam having maybe lasting into the mid-1980s. And that sounds weird until you look at some other countries, because West Germany, as it used to be before reunification, which had a much more phased program of modernization and didn't have the mass closures that we had. The last steam-hauled passenger trains in West Germany, modern West Germany, where all the modern stuff comes from, ran in 1977. So the railway history is full of surprises like that.
Got one here.
So you said in your opening remarks about the railways being sort of a continual sort of hotbed of innovation. As a naive observer, it looks like nothing much has changed in the last 30 years. Is that impression right, or has a lot of stuff changed?
Has innovation stopped on the railway? Yeah, I don't think it has. The British Rail had at the sort of the headline end, the British Rail did have a research centre at Derby, and that was one of the, it still goes on doing bits and pieces, but that was one of the casualties of privatisation, really. And the railways had, from innovation happening in haphazard ways, like Edmondson inventing his tickets, the railways had tried to harness it. So there was a staff college and then laboratories and things. All that happens in the 30s. So it has about a 50-year lifespan of being kind of at the core of what the railways are trying to do. But I think it's gone massively international, and that's part of it. In this country, it's suffered from privatisation because that all the uncertainties really associated with it, rather than necessarily the private model in itself. But no, I mean, things, track continues to evolve and change. The ways in which things are done are more efficient. And I think which isn't seen quite so much is safety. The railways are, the critics within the system say the railways are now too obsessed with safety, to tiny little imagined hazards, little fences going up at the ends of platforms. For what? To stop stray dogs or something, or to stop you walking. If you want to jump onto a train, believe me, you're going to do it. But there's a lot of sort of spotting the possible hazard thing going on. It's quite expensive to make those changes. But the general impetus is a good one. I mean, I think it's 8 years now since a passenger or a worker was killed on the railways. I mean, 8 used to be about the number of people killed on the railways every day. That was when there were so many men working on the tracks, coupling things up. Like the people you see there, that's they're huge wagons are being shunted up and down. You've got to go between them to couple them together. The driver isn't paying attention, or somebody's tired, or somebody slips. At the very least, you might lose a limb. So the railways used to kill people all the time, and now they don't. So I think part of it is about risk as well.
When the Channel Tunnel was being built, there was a feeling that it would link the continental and British networks and to be able to get through trains from Newcastle to Brunel. This hasn't actually happened.
No.
Why not? And should it?
I would have loved to have seen it happen. Sleeper trains are a special private enthusiasm, and do go on them if you get the chance. They're still there. But what you can't do is sleep under the tunnel. You used to be able to do it on something called the night ferry, incidentally. That left Victoria and was pushed onto a train ferry and taken off at the other end. You could sleep your way to Paris, but that stopped in 1980. But no, the answer is actually it's a fall in air prices, air travel prices, cheap flights. That was the deregulation of air travel. That was what really wrecked the business model. But it was too late to stop them building lots and lots of very high spec sleeper carriages, which were meant to do just that. You would have been able to get on the train, and it was very political. You had to have direct services from Wales and Scotland as well as England. You would have been able to get on the train in Glasgow, and then you'd dine as you passed through England, and then you'd go under the tunnel and you'd wake up in Berlin or something. And they built these things, but then the project was cancelled before they'd even turned a wheel in actual service. And these great white elephants, you can understand there was a lot of desire to hush this up because it was all rather embarrassing. And I sort of excavated a bit of the story, and there's John Prescott sort of ranting to the House of Commons in 1999 or something, saying that I'm suddenly being asked to come up with 200 million for these carriages that's no use for them. They don't work and they're sitting in a field or something like that. But they did manage to sell some of them to, I think, the Canadian railways. And now you can sleep your way through, the Rockies or wherever the great Canadian cross-continental journeys go. But yeah, I mean, it was thought to be the future with the Channel Tunnel and the sort of continuing sleeper service. And the answer is yes, it's air competition. It's almost like a miniature retread of what British Railways got wrong in the 50s, of not plotting the graph as to bigger lorries, better lorries, motorways. They didn't see motorways coming. So yeah.
Time for one more quick question. There's a gentleman in that one.
Hi, I was just wondering how you feel the British rail service compares against the international competitors. Let's just say, do you think the British people are too harsh on rail service, and are there any kind of international services that you admire and think significantly better than what we have in the UK?
Yes, foreign comparisons. I'm not the best person to answer that, partly because while I've been working on this book, I've been travelling on the British railway system for research purposes in sort of spare time, rather than travelling abroad so much. But I think one thing that is missed is the sort of density of traffic. It's the number of fast and efficient trains that are running all the time. It's the sheer numbers on the move. The numbers going in and out of Berlin, the numbers going in and out of Paris by train, the numbers shuttling back and forth between cities abroad. It just doesn't compare. And it's always been like that. I mean, the British steam-hauled railways had the highest number of the fastest trains in the world. The special high-speed lines, that's shifting it. But we've only got one of those, you know, and it only goes from London to the Channel Tunnel. So it's what's been achieved on what's essentially 19th century route map, and very often 19th century infrastructure, you know, bridges, viaducts and things. You know, within the limits. Because I mean, when they built the Liverpool and Manchester in 1830, the idea that trains would ever be electrified and travel at 100 miles an hour and weigh, you know, 8-10 times as much, and the whole thing not fall apart, you know, that would have been mysterious. If they'd had better ability to calculate their sort of risk factors and loadings and things, then they wouldn't have built them as sturdily as they did. But they tended to err on the side of caution. So a Victorian railway viaduct, you know, Brunel's extraordinarily elegant, spare and amazingly flat bridge across the Thames at Maidenhead, it's carried the high-speed trains for years and years, and now it's going to carry the electric trains going even faster, and it's, you know, it's still there. Who'd have guessed it? So yeah, there's a lot to be. It's I won't say doing the best of a bad job, but you know, really pushing what we've got to its limits. That actually that's should be a cause for modest national pride, perhaps.
Brilliant. Please join me. Thank you, Simon Brad.